The first thing that comes to mind when I think about culture is that's how things are done, right? It isn't that culture or mission or vision has an issue. It's that leadership isn't necessarily communicating that value, and they're not supporting the operations goal. Leadership is the transfer gear, right? Like if culture is the engine of an organization, leadership acts as the facilitator.
Hi, welcome to the Better Batch podcast, where batch process manufacturers learn from industry experts. I'm Alex Kovas.
And I'm Peter Suttard. We're joined today by John Bergmann, ready to share his approach to change management at facilities. John, we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
John, you argue that change management isn't possible at the facility or it's better done if we go from culture to leadership down to the floor on operations. Why is culture, in your mind, so critical to start with?
The first thing that comes to mind when I think about culture is that's how things are done, right? Like you can have all the SOPs in the world, you can have all the certifications in the world, but if your culture doesn't support that, it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't matter whether or not you have audits that say it does or not. It's the foundational piece for everything that happens in an organization, no matter its size. So really, that's why.
Sure. So then how does a company go about, what kind of culture do they need to build to make this possible? Is it unique to companies, or is there kind of set stuff that companies need to worry about?
I think principally it is not a unique function. It's really about every company exists to solve someone's problem, right? Like whether you're a retailer or a manufacturer or even a service provider, your customer has a problem and you solve it, right? So that gives you what I would call the core purpose, right? And your culture that you push downstream from that core purpose is really it's rooted in that. So I like to look into organizations whether or not they have a mission and vision statement, and whether or not it actually, if you break it down, if it matches what their core purpose is, right? Because it's nearly impossible to communicate purpose adequately if you can't articulate it. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting that you mentioned articulating it. I mean, I guess a question I always have about culture is how can it be transferred, right? Like, do you need to hire people who have the right culture to start with? Can you train for culture? Is it absorbed through osmosis somehow? Like, how do you get that consistent culture as you grow?
I think it's all of those things. It really has to start at the beginning, though. Most organizations have that founder, right? The founder who has the right of whatever the business idea or the founding group. And I think what's missed, especially when you scale and you begin to hire people from outside, especially when you're adding, right, when you're in growth mode in a small organization, you're adding capability, right? Like, this guy has forever, that person did the shipping and the quality, right? Because they just needed to. And now you bring someone else in. I think what gets missed there is in the frantic nature of some of those developments, there isn't enough attention taken to why are we here, right? And I think what you end up doing is you dilute that original culture, right? A lot of organizations have that difficulty in the transition from like very small to even small, especially to medium, right? Because I think medium in the U.S. is considered 100 employees or more, but even in that transition from maybe like 25 to 100 is very difficult on culture if you're not setting time aside to, all right, what are our values and how do we communicate these to all these new people we're bringing in, right? Because I've worked in organizations that have grown 30% in a year, right? And it is work to maintain that culture side. And again, growth can be a very distracting thing or a distracting activity from maintaining those things that are important to the organization, especially in more uncontrolled situations. Like currently I work in a medical device manufacturer, right? We have a significant compliance burden. So that kind of that has an act that has the effect in some ways of kind of helping put like bumpers on the lane, you could say,
Right, right.
to maintain some of those cultural things, because it isn't just that you want them in culture, it's that they're required for you to participate in the marketplace.
There's a certain required culture based upon the industry vertical, I guess. Yeah, is there?
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess I want to circle back because we talked about our area of subject today is change management, right? So culture is important. Okay, so can we connect the dots from culture to change management and change management for large and small projects as we execute?
Yeah, I think what I find, the way I find in practice to bridge that gap is to have that culture piece, because what that does, that purpose, that defines, or that can be built in to define value at in lower portions of the organization, right? Like I talk about culture, leadership, operations. On the operations standpoint, what the purpose piece is that drives that is a component of the culture and drives some of the culture elements is value propositions at the operational level, right? One of my favorite things is treating like your customer's the next process, right? Like we try to push that at every turn here, and that creating that value point that I'm serving this customer that is, the QC for this equipment or the next assembler in the line, right? Like I'm creating this value. So if you can communicate those value points with that group, they're more interested because they have more ownership over it, right? Like if you have a customer to serve, you have more intrinsic motivation to be interested in serving them. So when someone like myself who's a quality engineer, I try to do a week, like a Friday afternoon or Friday morning walk with a notepad to go sit down with people and say, hey, what was hard this week, right? Like what was difficult? Like what discrepancies did you find? And if they have that ownership piece, it's easier for them to think, well, this particular part of what I'm doing, and I do it a lot, is, like I get more errors from the person that gives me this, or they're coming back and they're looking for clarification here, right? So from a change management perspective, the purpose, the high level purpose, getting pushed all the way down, providing that ownership to people gives them better motivation to be interested in the change. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So making sure I understand it, maybe having a sense of both, hey, this is what we're building to serve this end user. And by the way, my job at shipping or receiving to bring stuff in, one of the end users I need to think about is not just our customer at the end of the day, but the staging team that's going to find this in the warehouse. And that helps. So, in both senses, you've given a sense of purpose to the business and individual people in there. What other cultural pieces are important to building a strong, healthy culture?
There's pieces related to looking for problems, right? Like that's something I really try. People are really good. It's a human thing to. I've done this way forever. I like to stay that way.
Right.
So I think there's a piece of it where you have to actively, whether you're in a specific leadership role or a named leadership role, or not, you have to be kind of the agent. I like to say change agent as a term.
Sure.
Where you're going down and you're saying, hey, is that really, can we do that better?
Alex is a perfect, when we see ERP implementations, it's like the people who are logging all the issues in the software.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Now, it's interesting. It struck me as you were talking, I could name kind of different cultural pillars that I sometimes see at companies, and some of them strike me as like synergistic with organizational change, and some are to some degree like anti-synergistic, right? Like, so if I have a company culture that's like bold change, big risks, right? Then like maybe that will help accelerate, adopting change. Conversely, like I might have something that is really, probably very useful if we're working in an industry where, perhaps such as medical devices, where we can damage reputation and hurt people if we make a mistake. Maybe I have a culture of measure twice, cut once, right? And if my culture is measure twice, cut once, and now I need to do an organizational change project, right? Like rolling out new systems or doing whatever. And everyone say, well, but how can we be sure? We have to slow down. And maybe that, I mean, not necessarily saying that that value is bad and it doesn't fit with organizational change, but it's more to say, like, at least knowing what the culture is allows you to fit how you execute that change with that culture. You have to come equipped in that second case with answers to the, like, here's why we're sure and here's how we know it will work, rather than just like, we're taking the plunge and we'll figure it out as we go and we don't mind getting hurt a little on the way, right? So it's, I don't know. I guess that wasn't really a question, but the question might be, what cultural pillars in particular, like specific ones like I just mentioned, do you feel like are, critical and useful for organizational change in your mind?
So part of our local quality policy here, right, is focusing on safety, performance, and customer service, right? So I like to, if we're going to push on a change, whether it's most of the time with medical devices, a lot of times your process level improvement is your more high value add, just because of the regulatory nature of, if you want to change equipment, right? Sometimes it's easier to get some efficiency out of how I build it, right, or how I test it, versus here, if I change this, maybe that's an electrical change, and I have, right, like my testing burden from an external source, right, and then reapproval gets huge, but I perhaps I can go down an avenue of a process change to make something better. So I think the value points, or excuse me, the understanding at the ops level, and even the mid-level engineering level of the value proposition of what the device does, what the process adds to that. If you can identify the value point locally, right, within one of the things we make has a number of sub-assemblies, right? Even within a sub-assembly, if I can say, what is this value point here? And if I'm going to implement a change, like you mentioned, the measure twice, cut once, right? People understand the value of that output. What often has not happened is the question of, well, why am I measuring twice? What was the root cause of me having to measure twice in the first place, right? And I do see from a corrective and preventive action structure, oftentimes real root cause analysis is not effective, right? Or it just doesn't go quite deep enough, right? And often that is an indication that you have like a leadership issue, right? Like, you notice I put the arrow coming back, right? And we might be talking about, or I generally talk about maybe the more idealistic way of how these interact, but there's also a very negative way that these interact. And oftentimes that root cause for why am I measuring twice when I should really just have to measure once, right? And a lot of times that goes right back to that leadership piece, right? It isn't that culture or mission or vision has an issue. It's that leadership isn't necessarily communicating that value, and they're not supporting the operations of all. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And we'll get to leadership in just a moment.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I'm not trying to jump ahead.
No, it's great. It's perfect. How can we gauge the culture at a company just before we've got a vision for what we want it to be? How can a company gauge how that culture is going, and then we'll go into leadership?
I think so, and I've seen this in a few places, is a lot of times they'll be like, oh, we do a culture survey. And I don't think that's right. I actually think process metrics are actually a better way to do that. And my example is, if you have work orders, say between a number of processes, so say a work order completes a build of something, right, and it goes through a number of steps, whether that's like a couple assembly steps, maybe a test step, and then maybe a final inspection. When you process that work order, if you can metric the various discrepancies that occur. So my example is clerical errors, right? Clerical errors aren't a huge deal, but occasionally they do cause, like, they'll cause a product reject, right? Like, if you can metric some of this stuff, often a simple clerical error can actually be indicative of an attention to detail issue, which is often not because the person doesn't care, right? I spent time in the military, and when we'd have a critique about a problem, the opening thing was like, none of the people involved in this came to work today to screw up, right? Totally. And that is a widely accepted perspective. So I find the data indicating I have this type of clerical error. I have it more commonly in this, because you collect this data for even a month or two, and you'll start to notice, like, oh, hey, like, this group has more of this problem than the other one. And then that root cause analysis that I mentioned before, I think is actually a better way to see where does your culture sit in, say, attention to detail. Attention to detail is a big point in, I would argue, all manufacturing, all modern manufacturing, right? And lack of that isn't necessarily because those people aren't capable of it. It's because it's not, the culture puts up with it not happening, right? So those clerical errors in the 15 to 20 minutes, whatever person needs to process that next has to go and chase those errors, right? That's something you live with, right? And that becomes your culture. And I think the data analysis side is a better metric of culture than sending out a survey that 30% of the people do, 30% ignore, and the remaining percent complain to their manager about it. Yeah. You know what I mean? So does that answer that question?
Totally.
It does. And, throughout this, I like to try to fit this into a frame of concrete examples. And, you just sparked one in my own mind, of course, my experiences with systems deployments, and something that we see crop up at a surprising number of companies is you roll out the software and you train the users and you train leadership, and everyone knows how to use it. And then for our products, a lot of the purpose is to put quality checkpoints in, right? And prevent errors and with those control points. And so we might have a situation where somebody has 3 drums of a chemical, all the same chemical, and we're going to, use some of this chemical in our batch. And we scan the first drum to say, here's what we're going to use in our batch. And the person gets an error message. And the error message says whatever. It's like, that lot's not approved yet. Or maybe something the user doesn't remember what it means, right? And what'll happen is they say, well, my job is to execute batches as fast as I can and to not have waste. Let me see if the next drum scans, and it scans okay. And then they dispense from the first drum that wouldn't scan into the tank. And now they don't know what lot they used. The inventory is wrong. And the batch is probably, and it's just like, we went through all this training so that you can understand how it worked. And then at the end of the day, your culture is telling you that speed is the most important thing. And I cannot stop and figure out the problem and solve it. I have to keep going instead.
I see that. So anyways, I see that everywhere too. Yes, no, I agree with you. I see that everywhere too. Schedule pressure is, in my opinion, one of the in fact, you can see on my board over here, it says something about quotas. I hate quotas. Mm-hmm. Quotas are the dumbest thing in the world, right? Because, like, you can have all the policy and training that you want that says quality, 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 but as soon as there's a quota,
right? We have conflicting requirements. Which one am I going to do? Do it right or do it fast?
Yep. and especially if you've tied that quota, and if the quota at all is attached to scheduling or anything like that, as soon as you put that time pressure on people, especially if there's monetary incentives, right? If there's bonuses associated with meeting quotas, it's over, right? Yeah. Like, you're gonna get the quality you want, but it's gonna be harder. Right? Because you're going to have to push them. You're going to have to, you know what I mean? You're going to have to do what I would say you're going to have to put negative pressure to culture from the leadership level. Mm-hmm. Right? So, I mean, it's going to come this way, but ultimately it's going to feed back into culture. Right? And I find those trade-offs unacceptable personally.
In defense of quotas is, let me play devil's advocate on behalf of quotas. Is it just people are setting dumb quotas? Like, we need we need 100 units at this quality threshold before we start counting it? Like, are they poorly set, or are they by their very nature destructive to kind of a quality-based process?
Most quotas are completely arbitrary,
Okay.
right? Like, well, because here's the thing. Now there's meeting demand,
Sure.
but that's not a quota, right? Like
Totally.
you can either meet demand, and so I don't mind what you might call a quota if it's demand plus, right? Because it's not in the business world, it's not a bad idea to have maybe 10%, 20, you know what I mean, depending on your
Sure.
right, because you've got to make some of these determinations internally, but like you should be meeting demand plus a relatively minimal amount, at least what you can tolerate based on right, like your assembly lead times, your supply chain leads, that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very complicated system, but to just say I want this many a month.
And I think as well, to the same point, you can set a quota, and you're right. Like if you put, okay, you have to do this number, but they have to be of X quality. You have to have like a very clear definition of what the acceptable and unacceptable result are going to be to have that be justified. Whereas if you don't have that, you can lean on a culture of quality, and the person is going to self-assess, okay, like, oh, it doesn't look right. And even though it's not in the list of things that I have to like meet to qualify, I still know I'm going to use my own judgment, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of that ownership piece I talked about with the culture, right? Like communicating the mission vision down and providing that piece. Like if I do this to the quality that I understand is required, right, I'm serving that purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so we promised a conversation on culture, mission accomplished. Let's talk about leadership. We've got a culture set up. We think we're ready to go forward with that. How does leadership fit in now between culture and operations?
So I like to say, I got my fun little notes here. I like to talk about leadership is the transfer gear, right? Like if culture is the engine of an organization, leadership acts as the facilitator, right? Their job is to make the system function, right? Like they don't necessarily do it, but their job is to facilitate the communication of mission, values, all that culture stuff, and also translate that into how the process structure works, right? Does the process structure give you the outputs you want, right? So their middleman isn't exactly the word, but
Sure.
that's functionally kind of what it is, right? It's you're facilitating people to succeed, to create the outputs that your organization exists to create. In fact, did I? Oh, actually, here, I wrote this thing I really like. I said, leadership is the box you deliver culture to the world in.
I always liked, you'd said this before, I always liked your
What's that?
culture is what leadership's willing to accept.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
like, yeah, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. It's like, okay, I guess that's our culture now.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned before, like this three-pronged iteration of it, or just interpretation I have of this, which may or may not be precise. It's fine. Is kind of like the worst game of paper, rock, scissors you can imagine, right? Because there's no rules, right? And you can, like, if you follow the paper, rock, scissors direction, maybe that's an illustration of it working the way it's supposed to. But in reality, there's no rules, right? Because like poorly communicated culture from leadership screws up operations, and what leadership deals with affects culture the opposite way, right? So I mean, there's a number of interactions, and not all of them are desired.
Yeah, great. It sounds like, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but leadership is responsible for organizing the warehouse or production or sales, and there's certain deliverables that are with that. And it sounds like what you're arguing is, with a corporate commitment around a culture, it's each of those leaders' responsibility to make sure their group is delivering within those boundaries or the bumpers of the culture that it's set up to help push stuff forward.
Yes, they are, and ultimately, right there. I'm a big fan of Edward Deming, and one of his shticks was always, right, like 90% of your issues are due to the system. So leader's job is to make that system not be stupid, right? So that's why I like the idea of those of leaders taking a very proactive position to not only reinforce the culture, but then, get that feedback back up the chain. Like what can be better about this, right?
I think some of the listeners, operational listeners, will have some thoughts about the intelligence of leadership, and maybe they're not the best place to root out stupidity.
Fair. Some of that though is right. There's relatively long-standing practices of, oh, hey, Bob has been he's a great technician. Bob has been a technician for years. You know what? Let's make him a manager. And they make him a manager, but the failure of the leadership when they bring the new leader on board is, what kind of leadership tools did they give this person? Did they ask Bob if that's what he wants? Like,
Totally.
and sometimes that's an excuse to just, well, we can't give him a raise unless he's promoted. But really, in some cases, you should just pay the guy more, right? Like, pay Bob more because he's amazing. Don't put him in a position that he has limited expertise. And I mentioned, sorry to back up too much, but I talked about, right, like rapid growth can be a difficult position for companies to deal with on a cultural level. Well, that translates into the leadership level, right? Because you can have organizations that are around for 30, 40 years that maybe they haven't grown exponentially, or they've grown nice and steadily. And that still results in they haven't taken a moment to be like, we should do leadership development, right? Because, I mean, that is a thing, right? That's, my graduate degree is in management science, right? And that was all like some psychology stuff, right? Some HR stuff, like leading people, like just like the scientific side of that. It was rather fascinating, actually. But that's a big piece of what leadership needs to be, is identifying who I can also make a leader, right? And honestly, in some cases that's not even. I honestly feel in some cases I have been a more effective leader in an organization when I'm not a manager, right? In fact, I don't know if you can see it. You might not be able to see it, but one of the things I have written up in the side corner there is, if you're not the boss, lead by example, right? Does that answer that question?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Yes, something, again, and bringing it back to the frame of change management, I feel like, in addition to representing the culture, a big part of leadership's responsibility is this prioritization and resource allocation, right? Like,
absolutely.
I have this menu of changes,
yes.
menu of projects, and selecting which ones we will invest in, and ensuring that it's like we don't have a bottleneck where there's too much, right? Like, a challenge that I've sometimes seen with, again, system deployments, because that's my view on the universe, is an organization says it's time for a system deployment, but also it's time to bring on new customers and increase our production load, and it's time to also do a quality systems change, and they don't all fit inside the box of things that we can accomplish by fall, and they don't even necessarily like make sense to do simultaneously, because one, it can be a prerequisite for the other, and too much change at once. So I guess that's the other piece for me about leadership. It's that, like, they've got the broad view so that they can ensure those pieces fit in together in the allocation of the resources, and then backing it up, right? So that's the second piece of that resource allocation is, okay, we've chosen this project. It's a lot of effort. It's going to require some trade-offs. Yes, we'll have to stop the production line sometimes. We'll have to reduce our capacity in this month to execute the project. That's okay. Everyone rely. Yeah. Oh, maybe you do have a quota, but here's what we're going to do to ensure that we can be successful with the project. And for me, that's where also leaders can help ensure that these big changes come to success.
I think a big piece, to your point about leadership prioritization, a big piece, and something I've run into in organizations, really kind of touching on your universe of ERP implementations, is flowcharts, right? You're like, hey, how does all this work together? And you get big wide eyes, and they're like, well, I think it works this way. A useful tool for leaders in any position, right? Whether they're leaders because they lead by example or actual, the manager, is to take the time and I noticed there's some problems in this department, or I know I need to, I need some change, or I need some new initiatives here, is to build that flowchart. Like, I don't like to say value stream map because those can be incredibly complicated. And sometimes the time required to make a good one doesn't match the outputs, right? But even just a basic flowchart of a single production process sometimes is highly valuable to identify. And then you take that down to the floor and you say, how is this wrong? Or
Exactly.
tell me, you know what I mean? Identify, you work with, this is that interface with the ops people, right? Or the frontline people is where you take that flow chart down and you say, hey, does this make sense? Is this correct? Can you show me how this is correct? And then you can actually, one of the things I love to do with flow charts is I love to take and make a very simple one. And then at the interfaces, I like to say, what are my outputs for this?
Sure.
And those, because the outputs of one box are almost always, with few exceptions, the inputs to the next box. And that is a very, very rapid and pretty simple way to identify problems, bottlenecks, and even places where we haven't even thought of this, right? Or we haven't thought that we could do this differently. So visual management for change activity, I think, is highly useful and underutilized.
Well, I think that's great because it ties into that the next person down the line is my customer, right? So I'm saying, I got you these boxes here, and the person's like, it would be great if they were stacked properly, so I could get that. Like, you don't even know as person one what the next person needs. That's really cool.
Absolutely.
Or we ran into something where it's you finish this particular thing and it's in a box. It's in a box that it ships to the customer. Well, at the end of the process, you put 10 of these in a big box, and that's where they go in a cart. And the cart is how we kind of do our lot transfer, right? Like one lot per cart, and then they all kind of stack together, and it's easy to do the stock rotation without a FIFO issue.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the questions we're asking now is the procedure says I have to put them in that big box, but I need to use that big box to ship maybe 20% of the time. So why am I putting in that big box so I can get to, you know what I mean? This is where those flowcharts really let you see, hey, wait, like why am I packaging this when I then unpackage it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm paying for someone to do something twice that doesn't even need to happen, right? So I mean that's a good example in recent experience here.
No, you're absolutely right, and those visual tools can be, such a great way to communicate. But it's also interesting, like just that point of seeking and hearing the input from operations and from people on the line gets just totally missed surprisingly frequently, right? Like the number of times I've heard during end user training, well, that's not going to work. I could have told you that 3 months ago, right? It's like, well, like you have to engage those stakeholders early, like especially the bigger the change. It's like you have to, like the people who are doing the work have to be involved to and share their insights. There's just no way you're flying blind otherwise. So like visual is a great way, but like you also don't skip that.
Yes.
People do skip that, and it's bad.
Yeah. We did. We recently moved to this facility, and that was a couple-year project, but it involved because we didn't build it; it had to be renovated. So that was a big piece of going to the different stakeholders and asking, like, what do you need? Like, what you work through with architecture, which is, I don't know if I would categorize some of the outputs that the various architecture firms give me as useful. But eventually you get to what is useful. It's interesting, and I realize it's not necessarily their expertise when you talk to them about, well, this is production flow, and this is what I need to put here, and this is why, and that's a separate podcast.
Sure. Yeah, not a lot of architects listening to this particular podcast, so you're safe here.
No. But I mean that's interesting though, because I mean as a feedback to I've worked with 3 different architecture firms on multiple facility designs, and so maybe to that point, like there's some input they could take from the operations side a little bit that would be useful to their effectivity. So we could say
we got culture, we got leadership. Let's dive into operations, what people would consider the actual change management part, but with this steady foundation underneath us. how are we rolling out these process changes? What's your advice for people listening?
So this is another thing actually, based on your pre-show notes. I thought of something I hadn't actually postulated before, and that was the way you transfer the leadership side down to operations. That's really, I refer to it as a bridge, and that bridge is built on like authentic relationships. We often see, right, the internet is full of the toxic managers, and they just don't understand and they don't listen, and like back in the office, we don't care if there's enough chairs. That kind of stuff is just everywhere, and really that's because they're not taking the time to build relationships that are value add to their personnel, right? And some of that is, like I mentioned before, you have quite a few organizations that have just never had or budgeted the time for leadership development, right? Like understanding that you're not, right? You can't, like, yes, you're the boss. You can come and say, do this, right? But if they don't know who you are, right? If they can't see the communication of value to them from the culture side, right? It's not going to happen, right? It's like, well, I've already done this. I've done this forever.
Yeah.
So, we got to build that bridge. We got to build those relationships. So I mentioned on the leadership side, right? They're responsible for those systems. So that's a great place on the operations side, from a change management perspective, of leveraging that expertise, right? We talked about visual tools. Not enough. One of the things I get to do is I get to do supplier surveillance. Excuse me. And a few of them that I've gone and seen have very simple procedures that are flowcharts, and I'm like, this is amazing, right? Because I mean, you need very little training to understand, right, how boxes and arrows work. Exactly, and some of those are highly effective. So I mean, from an example of communicating how the system needs to work very effectively, right, with maybe minimal effort isn't the right word, but with less tedium, right? I think is a good way to say that.
Sure.
Is ideal. So if we can have those processes in a state from the leadership side, but when they get to the floor, they're highly refined as far as what the intent, right? What's the output of this thing? I like to try from a quality standpoint, especially in a very regulated environment, is I like to shoot for a process structure where that compliance piece is so built into the system that it is invisible to the user, right? Like I shouldn't like, I think software is a good example of this. Good software, you don't see the guts of how it works. It just works, right?
Yeah.
So does that answer that question? I told you not to let me ramble too much.
It's a great start.
It flows nicely into the next question, which is really around, I'm going to give you a kind of a broad scope, right? It's around constructing SOPs and other documentation related to a new process or process change, and then how to train people and, put that change into practice. Like, how do you see that done in like any tactical pieces along the way, like you mentioned, using pictures, right? Hands-on work, just whatever way you could suggest is most effective to actually roll changes out once they've been determined to be the right changes.
I think the key word you mentioned there is training. Training is an underutilized, or maybe not underutilized is probably not the correct word. Lots and lots of organizations have training, or they'll send you to a seminar. I think the net result is that not enough organizations put in the correct perspectives on, okay, I'm going to send this person to auditor training. Like, what does that get me, right? What is when they come back and they have the certificate from this place, I paid $1,500 for a week or whatever it was, right? What does that then get me? And I think the same could be true from the internal training. I mentioned I forget if I mentioned while we're recording or before, but we're working on an overhaul of our onboarding structure, right? Because we realize we have a very large compliance burden, and we have a very complicated structure system. So what I want to do is we want to have the first week that person is with their department, they are foundationally set up to be able to jump right into their like on the job training, right? So I think to facilitate people being open to the idea that, hey, I can look at this and say, wait a minute, why do we do that, right? I think if you give them enough of the foundational, like this is the purpose, this is the structure, these are the pathways that you would go and pull the thread of, hey, I think we could do this better. I think if you do that from the get-go, and then you reinforce it, right? Like past the onboarding, past the first pass, like, okay, you're trained to do this particular assembly, or you're trained to run this machine. Beyond that is a continuous training loop, right? And one of those things needs to be on the medical side. We have one of our critical components of our certification structure is our corrective and preventative action structure. Well, the preventative side of that is actually intended as like an improvement mechanism. And unfortunately, to pull the culture thread up just a tiny bit more, is very often CAPA is like you got a CAPA, you're in trouble, right? And it is sometimes a Herculean effort from the quality side and the leadership side to change that perspective, right? Like, no, let's use this as a, like, maybe, yes, I found a problem and I'm doing a correction, and yet that's an opportunity for me to, first of all, fix that, but through my root cause analysis, understand how to prevent it, right? Or even it's not infrequent that root cause analysis on one problem identifies that I potentially have, maybe I don't have other problems, but I have opportunity for problem, right? And the more familiar the people on the front line, the operations level, is with why I have a structure, like why I have this certification structure, and why this risk management system, or why I have a particular sign off on a form, right, about a thing that I looked at and recorded, the more familiar they are with that, because you've given them training from the get go and then on board and then ongoing, the better they're going to be at coming either to their manager or identifying problems and change opportunities, and even being like the lead on some of those, right?
Yeah, so it seems like too the we can't be punishing people who have reported problems. It's like, yeah, I'm reporting would you like me to be silent about it? What would you prefer? And you can just tell me with your actions. You don't have to spell it out by with your words.
This is triggering a thought. One of the places I've seen some struggles with defining the right processes, and I think an area where a lot of organizations can improve their processes is when they are interdepartmental, right? So we've got production, and we've got warehouse, and we've got quality, and we've got sales and finance and everyone else, and within any one department where there is a leader or a team that can get the feedback and then take a top-down approach and build things, okay, then you have a chance of success. But there are certain processes that must involve more than one department and interacting, and usually that's where I see some of the gaps. It's like, okay, it's like warehouse and production and the handoff back and forth of materials, or it's quality coming in during material receipts and gathering the samples and the CVAs and everything, and the back and forth of warehouse again before it goes to production. That kind of stuff can get really messy, not because it's necessarily harder, but just because there's too many cooks and maybe nobody takes ownership. Do you have any tips or a way in which this framework can help us succeed with that?
I got to go back to the every process is your customer piece, right? Like that's got to be, like, I know we're technically in the operations box, but I mean that's really leadership's job, is to make sure. And I would argue that is like the CEO should be the champion of your fellow departments are your customers, right? Like I had a position, I was a quality manager about, oh boy, how long ago was that now? I was a quality manager about 10 years ago, and one of my mandates when I was promoted to that position was, at the time, the quality department was, not everybody loved the quality department,
Sure.
right? So we were kind of a, I don't know if black sheep's the right term, but we weren't anyone's favorite.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my mandates was to fix those relationships, and the way I did that was like FaceTime with my personnel, right? Um, like we started weekly stand-ups where it was like, I want to hear about all the problems you had on the floor. I don't want you taking that to the people you have, to that manager. I will do that. So my purpose then was to take those things. We'd have that weekly stand-up. That was like a half an hour. Right after that, I had a scheduled meeting with the production supervisor, and we would talk about and we would work out our plans. And then I would go over and talk to. It was a metal or they did hard goods manufacture, so machine shop stuff, metal finish, metal prep. So after talking to the production manager, I would go to the metal finish guy and I would say, hey, these are the issues we've seen here. I would go to the assembly group and I would talk to them. You know what I mean? So from my leadership position, I really pushed out into the other departments to say, hey, like we want to help, right? And we realized that previous leadership wasn't as useful to you, right?
Right.
Or tactful, right? They weren't trying to build a relationship because 90% of the time they had to come talk to you. It was, hey, this is screwed up. Like, why is this screwed up? What are you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I got completely away from that, right? Because I realized we're not gonna be able to scale into, the 3 new products we're working on if these relationships are still dysfunctional, right? Like I mentioned before, I see leadership as the bridge to the ops side, and but I mean, that's even within what the leadership box is, right? Like
Yeah.
each leader has to be interested in facilitating good relationships that their people have between the different departments that they interface with, right? Because obviously you can't monitor and control every single one of those interactions, but you can be the source of the standard for that, right? You can say, like, we're not gonna, like if this person's hostile and we can't fix it, we'll look at, like I did some shuffling of personnel and shifts, right? Because there were a couple people. Sometimes you just have relationships that aren't going to happen, right? So it's leadership's job to make those things function, right, to the
Mm-hmm.
maximum extent possible.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer that question?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's probably the right time to see, like, how can we tile this together, right? So we've got culture, we've got leadership, we've got operations. What are the kind of day-to-day and week-to-week processes and structures that can help us fit all this together and help the machine, keep running smoothly? Like, what are the processes that we run as leaders and as an organization that move the chain along?
I find one of the most useful things is just the different leaders need to be seen, right? Like when I was that quality manager, I had a number of things. I was like, I want to do this and I want to do this. And I had a lot of things that went well, but there were a few that very much did not. And that was because I talked about it once
Mm-hmm.
and then I didn't follow up and I
Yeah.
didn't ask. Right. So I think the way to tie all these 3 elements together that I'm very interested in I don't know if preaching the gospel is the right way to say that, but it's
Testify,
kind of,
John.
yeah. Is like you have to be present, you have to be seen, asking questions and providing support, right? Like I mentioned, I do. I have my notebook I take around on Fridays, and I just go. I try to go to a different group even though I'm a quality engineer in the quality department. I'll go over to the shipping receiving people and be like, what could be better? In fact, we just did an improvement in their area, right? I mentioned we designed this facility and laid it out, but we added a table to their workspace, which seems like a silly thing,
Sure.
but like it improved their throughput and quality of life by way more than it's a big table. It's like $1,000. So really, we facilitate all these things by our presence and our action, right? Like,
chapter and verse from the book of John. Those are the questions I had.
And that was fantastic. Something I like to ask most people who come on the pod is, do you have a favorite KPI? Maybe it's not the most important KPI, but something that you think is particularly valuable and that you gain insight from.
I don't think I have a favorite, right? Because the problem is I like to ask a variety of questions about different things, and then I generally in the moment I pull that thread about one thing, right? Like, so it's. I hope you're not disappointed that I'm not like, oh, I really like the metrics
John loves
per
all
million.
his children. What that's no problem there.
I'm up for the challenge. So I'll reframe the question situationally, and I'll give you option A or option B. So, what would be a good KPI around company culture, right? What would be a way to measure, is the company culture is as is written? And I don't have an answer to that, so I'm putting you on the spot. Or option B would be, what is a KPI around effective organizational change and our ability to process initiatives that we choose to execute?
I think you look at one of the things I'm working on getting going in this particular location, I've deployed it in other places, is an idea submission structure, right? And I think a good indication of people's interest in change or interest in improvement, whether that's making their own life better. And a lot of times, idea submission structures are good because people are somewhat innately self-serving. So if you can give them an avenue to say, I am really sick of these forms because the form layout is dumb, right? Or I'm confused. And every organization has a few forms that everybody hates, right? Because there's not intuitive, or they're constantly have errors. So I would say I like to deploy idea systems, and then
just
the
see
analysis
how people are interacting with it.
Yes, the analysis I like to do with that is then which departments put in more ideas, right? Because then you're going to get an idea of which leaders are waving the flag, you might say, in a manner that serves the organization.
Very cool.
So that's kind of my take on that.
Awesome.
Beautiful. John, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really lucky to have you, and I certainly learned a lot.
Same here, John. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I hope I was on topic well enough.
You're fantastic.
Oh, yeah. So. Oh, and John, before we go, how can people find you?
Great question.
I'm on LinkedIn. I work for Vanilla Incorporated. I do some side hustles. One of those is culture leadership operations consulting. And
fantastic.
So find me on LinkedIn. You can find all that stuff.
Perfect. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah. Thanks again, John.
I appreciate it. Anyway,
Thanks, John.
Thank you both.
Thanks for watching the Better Batch podcast. We're so happy you could join us. If you've got an idea for show ideas, or you just want to improve your manufacturing, reach out to us and we'd love to hear from you.